From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We are in the midst of one of the greatest national crises in our country's history.
It is a scene of utter devastation in the Bahamas after being ravaged by Hurricane Dorian. Residents of Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas are now bracing for the storm. We'll go to the Bahamas for the latest. Then we look at press freedom and threats to journalists around the globe. In the Philippines, the American journalist and activist Brandon Lee remains in critical condition a month after being shot outside his home in what supporters believe was an assassination attempt by the Filipino government. Meanwhile, in Nigeria, the independent journalist, former presidential candidate Moyole Sowore, has entered his second month in prison after calling for anti-government protests.
Are you not tired of this government? We are tired. Are you not tired of hunger? We are tired. Are you not tired of no unemployment? We are tired.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Bahamas have been left utterly devastated after the Category 5 Hurricane Dorian ravaged the island nation. The death toll has gone up to at least 7 people in the Bahamas as the island continues its rescue efforts. Dramatic images reveal the extent of the damage, with entire neighborhoods decimated. On the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama, as many as 13,000 homes have been destroyed or heavily damaged. Some reports say 70 to 80% of the affected areas remain underwater, including the Grand Bahama International Airport. New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted about the disaster. She said, "This is what climate change looks like. It hits vulnerable communities first." Residents of Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas are now bracing for the storm as it heads towards the U.S. as a downgraded Category 2. We'll have more on Hurricane Dorian after headlines. Meanwhile, Tropical Storm Fernand formed in the western Gulf of Mexico Tuesday and is expected to make landfall in northeastern Mexico today, bringing heavy rainfall and floods to the region. Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam has formally withdrawn the highly contested extradition bill today after months of mass protests.
The Government of Special Administrative Region will officially withdraw the bill and eradicate the worries of people. The Security Chief will propose a motion to withdraw the bill after the legislative meeting is back. From this month onwards, I and all the officials will visit the community and speak to the people from all walks of life who have different beliefs in politics and different backgrounds, and using that as a communication platform for them to voice their discontent and find ways to address the problems.
Demonstrators in Hong Kong have engaged in over 13 weeks of protests triggered by the extradition bill that critics warn threaten the semi-autonomous territory's sovereignty. Protest demands have since expanded to include a number of pro-democracy reforms, Lam's resignation, and accountability for police aggression against demonstrators. In Britain, Prime Minister Boris Johnson faces an uphill battle as lawmakers prepare to vote on whether he'll have to go back to European Union leaders to negotiate a new withdrawal date for Brexit. This comes one day after a stinging defeat Tuesday, in which rebel Conservatives joined with the opposition in an attempt to block a no-deal Brexit and saw Johnson lose his working majority in Parliament. Conservative Member of Parliament Sir Nicholas Soames, Winston Churchill's grandson, was one of the 21 lawmakers who defied Johnson. Johnson says he'll expel the rebel lawmakers from the party. Soames called his expulsion, quote, "the fortunes of war." Prime Minister Johnson is expected to call for a snap election if he loses the upcoming vote. This is opposition Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn.
We live in a parliamentary democracy. We do not have a presidency, but a prime minister. Prime Ministers govern with the consent of the House of Commons, representing the people in whom the sovereignty rests. There is no consent. There is no consent in this House to leave the European Union without a deal. There is no majority for no deal in the country.
Protesters have been taking to the streets in London and around the UK this week for Stop the Coup and anti-Brexit demonstrations. Back in the United States, Walmart announced it'll stop selling ammunition for handguns and short-barrel rifles, which can be used in military-style semi-automatic assault weapons. It also will stop selling handguns in Alaska, the only remaining state where it sells handguns. In addition, the retail giant said it would discourage openly carrying firearms in its stores and back calls for stronger background check laws, as well as a debate on assault weapons ban. A recent Quinnipiac poll shows 60% of Americans back an assault weapons ban. Walmart will, however, continue to sell long-barrel hunting rifles and shotguns and ammunition for those weapons. Walmart CEO Doug McMillon sent a letter to Congress Tuesday outlining the company's policy changes. The announcement follows a spate of deadly mass shootings, including last month's anti-immigrant massacre at an El Paso, Texas Walmart, which killed 22 people. The Kroger grocery chain has also announced it will request shoppers stop openly carrying firearms. Kroger stores previously adhered to local laws on the matter. Last year, Kroger ended sales of guns and ammunition in its stores in Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. In another mass shooting, just days after the Western Texas rampage, which killed 7 people, a 14-year-old teenager shot and killed 5 family members at their home in Alabama Monday. The boy then called the police to confess to killing his father, stepmother, and siblings, according to the reports. The victims included a 5- and 6-year-old and a 6-month-old baby. Authorities have not yet determined where the teenager obtained the handgun he used. The Pentagon agreed Tuesday to divert $3.6 billion from its budget to put towards President Trump's border wall. The funds will come out of 127 military construction projects in order to build 175 miles of the wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. Defense Secretary Mark Esper's formal authorization means the reappropriation of funds can go ahead without approval from Congress. In February, Trump declared a national emergency in order to justify using federal money to build his wall. Democratic lawmakers blasted the move. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said it violated the separation of powers and, quote, undermines our national security. The ACLU vowed to challenge, quote, Trump's latest effort to raid military funds for his xenophobic wall, unquote. In more immigration news, the Trump administration appeared to reconsider a move to force immigrants receiving critical medical care to leave the United States. Last month, Citizenship and Immigration Services started denying medical deferred action exemptions to immigrants with serious illnesses and their families. In letters sent to applicants of the program, the agency told them they must leave the United States or face deportation. The move came without any advance notice or public announcement and sparked severe backlash from immigrant rights groups, medical professionals, and Democratic lawmakers. On Monday, officials said no deportations had been initiated since the policy change and that it would, quote, reopen previously pending cases for consideration, unquote. However, it's unclear what the longer-term fate of the program will be. In Guatemala, the runner-up in last month's presidential election, Sandra Torres, was arrested at her home in Guatemala City early Monday morning. According to Guatemala's Attorney General, Torres is suspected of breaking campaign finance rules and unlawful association in the 2015 elections, the year Torres lost the presidential bid to outgoing President Jimmy Morales. More recently, she lost to right-wing leader Alejandro Giammattei, who will be inaugurated January of 2020. Former First Lady Sandra Torres' political career has been plagued by allegations of corruption and ties to criminal organizations. Her arrest came on the eve of Guatemala's UN-backed Anti-Corruption Commission, CICIG's formal expulsion from Guatemala. CICIG has led the investigation against Torres. CICIG issued a final report describing Guatemala as being captured by corruption at the hands of a mafia coalition involving politicians, the business community, and wealthy elites that is, quote, willing to sacrifice Guatemala's present and future to guarantee impunity and preserve the status quo. Italy has reached an agreement to form a new government, avoiding snap elections following the disintegration of its right-wing ruling coalition last month. Members of the anti-establishment Five Star Movement have approved a deal to share power with the center-left Democratic Party. The new government means far-right anti-immigrant leader Matteo Salvini will lose his powerful role within the government for now. Giuseppe Conte will stay on as prime minister after initially resigning following Salvini's attempted power grab. He's expected to seek presidential approval of the deal today. As commemoration ceremonies took place over the weekend to mark the 80th anniversary of Germany's invasion of Poland, President Trump sent a message of congratulations to Poland. At a Sunday press conference, Trump said, quote, "It's a great country with great people." Meanwhile, German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier asked Poland for forgiveness and referred to the German invasion of Poland in 1939 as a war crime. Trump had been scheduled to be at the official ceremony in Warsaw this weekend, but canceled his trip due to Hurricane Dorian. Vice President Mike Pence was in attendance. President Trump played golf through the weekend. Senator Elizabeth Warren has unveiled her plan to tackle the climate crisis Tuesday, ahead of tonight's 2020 town hall on climate change. The plan adopts ideas put forward by Washington Governor Jay Inslee, who put the climate crisis at the center of his campaign before dropping out of the presidential race last month. The $3 trillion plan, which would be paid for by reversing Trump's tax cuts for the wealthy, includes zeroing out carbon emissions for commercial and residential buildings, as well as most passenger vehicles in the next decade, switching to renewable electricity by 2035, and creating unionized clean energy jobs. Senators Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar, Kamala Harris, and former Housing Secretary Julian Castro have also released climate plans in recent days, ahead of the CNN climate town hall that will go from 5 o'clock tonight until midnight. In a victory for voting rights advocates, a North Carolina court unanimously rejected a gerrymandered legislative map Tuesday, giving state officials 2 weeks to redraw North Carolina's district map. The three-judge panel accused state Republicans of violating North Carolina's Constitution and engaging in, quote, extreme partisan gerrymandering. The group Common Cause, which brought the case before the court, celebrated the ruling, saying, quote, politicians in Raleigh will no longer be able to rig our elections, and that they would continue to make sure the legislature's new districting efforts are fair and transparent. And the founder of a well-known so-called gay conversion therapy program has come out as gay and apologized for his role in the harmful practice. McCrae Game founded the faith-based Hope for Wholeness, previously known as Truth Ministry, in 1999, which aims to change a person's sexuality through counseling and other interventions. An estimated 700,000 people have gone through so-called conversion therapy, according to a UCLA study. 18 states and over 50 cities and counties have enacted laws or rules against the practice, according to Human Rights Campaign. This is McCrae Game speaking in an interview with the Post and Courier.
Conversion therapy is not just a lie, but it's very harmful. But when it takes it to the point of you need to change, and here's a curriculum, here's how you do it, and you haven't changed yet, keep at it, it will happen.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our viewers and listeners across the country and around the world. We begin today's show in the Bahamas. It is a scene of utter devastation after the Category 5 Hurricane Dorian ravaged the island nation. Residents of Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas are now bracing for the storm, which has been downgraded to a Category 2. The official death toll in the Bahamas is at 7, but is expected to rise. On the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama, as many as 13,000 homes have been destroyed or heavily damaged. Rescue efforts have been hampered by widespread flooding. Some reports say 70 to 80% of the affected areas remain underwater, including the Grand Bahama International Airport. This is Bahamian Prime Minister Hubert Alexander Minnis.
We are in the midst of one of the greatest national crisis in our country's history. The government will bring to bear every resource of state possible to help the people of Abaco and Grand Bahama or any other island nation that's necessary. No effort or resources will be held back.
Bahamas Red Cross and other relief groups are scrambling to help survivors.
They need every piece of help they can get. It is totally, it's devastating. It's heartbreaking when you look and see the initial videos that are coming out of there. And so we know from what we've been seeing and hearing that this one will require the help of all persons.
We go now to the Bahamas, where we're joined by two guests. Crystal DeGregory is with us, a professor who was born in the Bahamas, now serves as the director of the Atwood Institute for Race Education and the Democratic Ideal at Kentucky State University. She's joining us from Freeport in Grand Bahama. Also in Freeport, Sam Teicher, the founder and chief reef officer for Coral Vita, which is based in Freeport, Grand Bahama. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Under these severe conditions. I wanted to start with Crystal DeGregory. You are Bahamian. You were just visiting your family when the hurricane made landfall. Can you describe the scene and what's happened to your family there?
It is devastating. The toll of the hurricane is truly indescribable and unprecedented. Much of the island is under flood water. Professionals and deputized citizens alike are still out in the field attempting to rescue those in distress. And again, it's just pretty mind-boggling because this is not supposed to happen to these areas. These are inner community, they are suburbs, if you will, not sea-facing properties, and so we really otherwise thought them to be safe.
What happened to your sister and her family?
Yeah, it was just crazy. You know, the call came in that, you know, the water was rising. It was soon to be at their step. And then the next call came in that their neighbor's house had taken in substantial water, that they had sought refuge with my sister, but that the waters in her house were also rising several feet really quickly, almost at once. It was like flash flooding. It was, you know, virtually dry or just relatively wet, and then they were just flooded. And I tried to no avail to use every resource of social media and the public and people actually in the United States calling back into the Bahamas to try and get them some recourse. But again, they needed a boat. I mean, no truck was big enough, tall enough to wade through waters which were anywhere from waist deep to chest high. And so they had to wade through those waters themselves and sought refuge with a neighbor, which is where they bunkered down, some 20 of them, Sunday or Monday night. I don't even know what day it is, so I don't even know what day that was, unfortunately.
We're also joined by Sam Teicher, the founder and chief reef officer for Coral Vita. Could you talk about your experience during the storm and in the aftermath, now that the storm has passed, what's been the government recovery or rescue operation?
Yeah, thanks for having us sharing this story. The Bahamian people really are going to need a lot of help. I was very fortunate to be located on the south side of the island. I was on a canal system, so we were definitely worried about storm surge, but we were in a strong house and were able to weather it. We had a few friends hunkering down with us. Couldn't really venture outside for most of the storm. It was relentless, nonstop wind, rain, but I somehow one that had hundreds of people in it, and constantly getting videos, seeing flooding across the island, hearing stories of people fleeing into attics and often into roofs, and being, fortunate here to not have to deal with that, but also being trapped and not being able to help. That is now the sort of focus is rescue. Once we were able to, we had a pickup truck and we had some supplies, power tools. So my friends Joe and Luke, yesterday we went out. We delivered fuel to teams that had been lent jet skis that were being used for rescue operations. There's definitely a shortage when it comes to fuel, water, food, medical supplies, diapers, hygienic products. As soon as I get off the phone here, actually, I'm going to go back out with Joe and Luke there right now trying to get a family we couldn't get to last night that has a small kid who had been trapped on the north side of the island, kind of near the airport. So it's, from what I've seen now that the storm has passed, we've been out there. As Crystal was saying, it's utter devastation, and Bahamians, people are really resilient and incredible, but they really need help from the outside world now.
And Sam Teicher, when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico a couple of years ago, virtually all the electricity and cell phone service went out. What is the situation with basic utilities right now? Is there any electricity across the island? And you're obviously having cell phone conversations, so you're able to get through. Sam, did you hear me? Oh, well.
Yeah. Hello, are you there?
Yes, we can hear you now. Yeah, I asked about the situation with utilities, with the internet, with electricity, with cell phone service.
Well, that was a good example of connectivity there. I still don't have power at my house. Had backup storage units that I've been able to charge my phone, and our neighbor has a jet generator.
Sam, we're going to go to break, and we're going to reconnect with you to try to get an improved service. We really also want to ask you about your work there and to draw the map of the Bahamas for us. I mean, this archipelago of 700 cays and islands might surprise people, might think of it as one or two islands, but also what's happening to the coral reefs. Sam Teicher is founder and chief reef officer for Coral Vita, based in Freeport, Grand Bahama, and we're also on the phone with Crystal DeGregory, who is a Kentucky professor, Bahamian by birth, visiting her family when the storm struck. Stay with us.
Mother Earth suffocating. Oh, yes. Mother Earth suffocating because of the way that we living. We must now take a step so she could have a breath. Mother Earth suffocating because of the way that we living. We must now take a step so she could have a breath in this global warming. Jaja is giving us a warning. Warning. Global warming. Jaja is giving us a warning. Oh yes. All right. Natural resources that Jaja
Global Warming by Asi Delamore. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Bahamas have been devastated by the Hurricane Dorian, Category 5. Crystal DeGregory still on with us from Grand Bahama, historian at Kentucky State University, caught in Grand Bahama in Freeport when she was visiting her family, and Sam Teicher, founder and chief reef officer for Coral Vita, which is also based in Freeport, Grand Bahama. We're going to try this again, Sam. Describe the geography and also your work there, the coral reefs. There's 24-hour-a-day coverage of this devastation of the hurricane, but almost never do they mention the issue of climate change.
Yeah, you're spot on, Amy. I mean, this is a climate emergency right now. There's hundreds of islands throughout the Bahamas, often very low-lying, And the whole reason I'm down here with my team is because we're at a state where we have to grow corals to restore dying reefs. Obviously, the best thing to do is to stop killing them and other ecosystems, not only for their ecological wonder and supporting, marine life around the world, but in cases like hurricanes, they shelter coastlines from storms. A healthy coral reef reduces wave energy on average of 97%. So we came down here to build our first coral farm. It was totaled. We're going to have to rebuild it. Obviously, the priority right now, though, is helping people. So, yeah, Earth is a living planet. The ecosystems that support us all are dying right now. And ultimately, that really affects us because coral reefs, mangroves, forests, you name it, they provide people with food, clothes, and shelter. So we're going to also have to go here. We plan to do this work all around the world. There are lots of people doing coral reef restoration, and that's kind of the state we're at right now. We need government, industry, the media to help solve climate change. But in the meantime, since they're often failing in that regard, need to sort of jumpstart a restoration economy that can help repair these ecosystems that take care of all of us.
And Crystal DeGregory, I wanted to ask you, so far we've been hearing that the death toll is at 7, but given the devastation, the photos we've seen, it seems very likely that number will grow. How do you assess how the government prepared for the storm, and then how they've been acting in the first 24 hours or so after the storm finally left the islands?
We always think that people can do a better job, and there is perhaps room for improvement. I personally believe that it is likely that the death toll is higher than initially reported, but we have to remember that we were amid a storm bearing down on a neighboring island, and the panic that would have ensued from reports of mass death would not have helped those who face Dorian's wrath here on Grand Bahama to endure it any better. We will just see in the days to come. I'll say that, whereas I could say that, the government's response perhaps could be better, there could not have been a better response from scores of young Bahamians who are using social media in ways never before seen in previous disasters to rally help, both immediate for those seeking rescue, as well as long-term in terms of letting the world know that we do, in fact, need their help.
On Tuesday, a spokesman for the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, Dennis McLean, warned that the intense hurricanes in the Atlantic in recent years are linked to climate change.
This is the 4th consecutive year that we have witnessed an extremely devastating Atlantic hurricane season, including Category 5 hurricanes like Dorian. The sequence cannot be divorced from the fact that these last 5 years have been the hottest ever recorded because of the continuing rise in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Hurricane Dorian crystallizes the existential threat posed to small island developing states by the ongoing climate emergency. This is an enormous humanitarian and development challenge for the Bahamas.
So that is the spokesperson for the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And Sam Teicher, you are from the United States. You live in the Bahamas, on Grand Bahama, as you try to restore the coral reefs. What does it mean to have the President of the United States right next door denying climate change? What kind of effect does that have on the islands of the Bahamas, if it does?
Well, first, I do want to just echo what Crystal said, and the Bahamian people have really rallied to help people out here. So tremendous credit to them, and the priority really is on help and relief and rescue right now. If I had a country club along the Florida coast, I would want a coral reef that's healthy off of it, because if nothing else, it's going to lower my insurance rates because it's going to reduce storm damage. So you can think about it from an economic perspective, public health perspective, a humanitarian, ecological, national security. Coral reefs, the Arctic, the Amazon, all these ecosystems, and ultimately the impacts of climate change affect people everywhere. So I would really encourage the president to take better advice from better people. I think he has the ability to change his mind and to really use the resources and influence and power of a country like the United States to do the right thing, because climate change is a clear and present danger to all of us.
We want to thank you both for being with us. Sam Teicher is the founder and chief reef officer for Coral Vita, which is based in Freeport in Grand Bahama, one of the most devastated islands of the Bahamas right now, along with Abaco. And Crystal DeGregory, historian at Kentucky State University, went home to the Bahamas to see her family when Hurricane Dorian struck. This is Democracy Now! Of course, we'll continue to cover this story. We'll be covering Climate Week here in New York, as well as the UN Climate Summit that's taking place. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we're spending the rest of the hour on press freedom and threats to journalists around the globe. In the Philippines, American journalist and indigenous and environmental rights activist Brandon Lee remains in critical condition more than 4 weeks after being shot multiple times outside his home in the northern Philippines in early August. Lee was shot at least 4 times in the back and face on August 6th, and what his family and advocates say was an attempt by the Philippine government to kill him. Now they're calling for the U.S. Embassy in the Philippines to protect Lee as he recovers in the hospital, fearing another attack. This is Brandon Lee's mother, Louise Lee, speaking in late August.
Before we left San Francisco, we heard that Brandon had 6 cardiac arrests. When we arrived in Baguio City, we heard that he had his 8th cardiac arrest. I can't believe that my son has had 8 cardiac arrests and has survived. And he's still alert, and he smiles, and he puckers his lips to give me a kiss. And I'm just so happy. I'll be so happy when he returns home to the United States. My family and I are very thankful for the care that he is receiving here at Baguio General Hospital, but we are very concerned for his safety. The assailant is still out there and could come back to finish the job. I'm hoping that the U.S. Embassy and other U.S. representatives will be able to help us with medically evacuating Brandon and bringing him back home to San Francisco and away from his perpetrators, people who are out there wanting to kill him.
Brandon Lee is a Chinese-American born and raised in San Francisco, but he spent the last decade in the Philippines, where he has a wife and young daughter. He's correspondent for the weekly newspaper Northern Dispatch, where he reports on community issues and land use, including corporate and government control of ancestral lands for mining and dams. He's also a paralegal for the Cordillera Human Rights Alliance and activist with the Ifugao Peasant Movement, a community group that's currently protesting a hydropower project and increased militarization in Cordillera. Lee's editor at Northern Dispatch told the Committee to Protect Journalists that he's been targeted for this work since 2015, facing relentless surveillance from Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte's government. The Guardian reports he had been labeled an enemy of the state on social media before the shooting. For more, we go to San Francisco. We're joined by 2 guests. Matt Haney is a San Francisco supervisor who led a fact-finding delegation to the Philippines last week to investigate the attack on the American journalist and activist Brandon Lee. And Raquel Redondias is a member of the San Francisco Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines and a friend of Brandon Lee, visited Brandon in the hospital with Supervisor Matt Haney last week. Supervisors in San Francisco are like city council members. Supervisor Matt Haney, you led this delegation. Why did you go from San Francisco to the Philippines, and what did you find?
Well, we went first and foremost to visit Brandon. Brandon is a San Francisco resident. He grew up here. He went to public schools here. And we had been deeply concerned about his well-being. A couple weeks ago, before we went, I authored a resolution really condemning some of the things that are happening and the human rights abuses in the Philippines. And then shortly thereafter, one of our own, Brandon, was shot in this attempted assassination. So we wanted to go out and visit him. We wanted to bring him gifts. We wanted to bring him our love and solidarity from San Francisco. and we wanted to learn of his condition and what we could do to support him. We also wanted to learn about the broader human rights situation in the Philippines. I represent a district that has a very large Filipino community in south of Market, and many of my residents that I represent are impacted. And we're concerned. There's a long history of people around the world really standing up for human rights and democracy in the Philippines. And so I wanted to make sure that we did whatever we could to not just support Brandon, but to support the Filipino people.
And Matt Haney, when you got a chance to talk with him, talk about what you learned about the actual assassination attempt. This was in his home that he was attacked. Could you talk about that somewhat?
This was at his home. He has a young daughter who was there at the time. He was going out in his backyard to feed his dogs, and he was shot multiple times. He has 3 bullets that are still inside his body, one near his spine and one in his face. He has no doubt that this was the Philippine army that targeted him. We got to meet with his colleagues and his family and his friends while we were there. They told us that a number of them were also visited by the army on this same day, but they weren't home. He had experienced escalating threats to his life from the military in the lead up to the assassination attempt. So this is in a context in which Brandon has been deeply involved in fighting for the rights of indigenous people in the Philippines, human rights, defending their natural resources, particularly against a proposed dam in the area where he works. And he and his colleagues and his friends feel very confidently that this was from elements connected to the Philippine government. The police have told the family that they believe that it was Brandon's friends that actually did this, which is an absurd thing from what we saw and everyone we talked to. So he's still very much
I want to turn to Brandon in his own words. I mean, this is over a year ago. In a video message released in July 2018, of course, before the assassination attempt, he talked about the threats and harassment he and his colleagues were confronting.
Hello, my name is Brandon Lee. I'm a volunteer at the Ifugao Peasant Movement, IPM. For us, we have been harassed, intimidated, threatened, with death threats, vilified, red tagged, under surveillance constantly since 2010. This has a lot of it has to do with us defending the land, life, and resources of indigenous
So that's Brandon Lee over a year ago, before he was shot. Raquel Redondiez, you went on this fact-finding mission with Supervisor Matt Haney and others. You were a close friend of Brandon Lee. If you can talk about what he put out right before the assassination attempt. He was already saying he was targeted and who he was targeted by and for what.
Yes, even in the weeks leading up to the attempted assassination, he had emailed some of his friends in San Francisco and told us that he was being visited at his home, at his workplace by the military or paramilitary forces. And, you know, he was very concerned about this. They were even asking about his daughter. And so this is, you know, something he, as Matt said, he's been facing harassment, intimidation, even death threats for several years now for his work organizing amongst the indigenous communities in the Cordilleras.
And Raquel, I'm wondering, this case has not received very much attention at the national level. I'm thinking, for instance, of the case of Otto Warmbier, another American student in North Korea who was jailed, and there was a whole campaign to get him released. And finally, when North Korea did release him, he ended up dying as a result of a coma there. And even President Trump got involved. Here, what's been the reaction at the national level to the fact that this is an American who was killed in the Philippines? Shot, I'm sorry, in the Philippines.
Well, definitely family and friends have been reaching out to our congressional representatives. His mom reached out immediately to the U.S. Embassy to seek support for protection from Brandon while he's still at the hospital recovering. The family's been requesting medical evacuation for Brandon at the soonest time. And sadly, we've not really gotten a proactive response. I think there's definitely, private concerns expressed to family members at meetings with congressional offices. But what the U.S. Embassy response was actually to contact the Philippine National Police to provide protection at the hospital, which was not welcomed by Brandon's family and colleagues who do believe that the Philippine National Police has been part of the harassment and the intimidation that Brandon and his colleagues have been experiencing the last several years.
If you can talk more about that. Now, Sean Crispin with the Committee to Protect Journalists said, quote, authorities should leave no stone unturned in identifying and apprehending the perpetrators behind the shooting of journalist Brandon Lee. Until President Rodrigo Duterte shows he is serious about protecting journalists, all the talk of investigations will come to nothing and violent attacks on the press will continue, he said. If you can describe who you know is behind this attack and also what happened to others that night that he was shot.
I mean, what we've learned in our trip throughout the Philippines is that this is not an isolated incident. In the case of Brandon, 7 other of his colleagues were visited at their home or their offices that same evening. Fortunately for them, none of them were home, and it was only Brandon that was home at the time. And so the other colleagues did not suffer his fate. But throughout the Philippines, what we've heard is that where there are communities organizing and resisting the president's build, and kill development policy, the military is deployed against them to harass them, to intimidate them, and even to forcibly evacuate them, communities from their ancestral domains.
And Matt Haney, if you can talk about what's happening in the Philippines overall, the broader context of the extrajudicial killings. I mean, Rodrigo Duterte, close ally of the United States, President Trump has applauded him over and over, even as he himself, Duterte, has boasted about personally killing people.
I mean, it's an awful situation throughout the country. President Duterte has been pretty clear about what he intended to do, and he's doing it. He's said that if you are a do-nothing, if you are somebody who's a rebel or a communist, someone who's involved with drugs, that he will kill you. And shockingly, there have been tens of thousands of people who have been killed by the Philippine government, some under this banner of the war on drugs, which we found was simply a war on the poor. In many cases, people were killed simply because they were living in a certain place and at the wrong place in the wrong time. We met with some of the folks from the night crawlers, which are photojournalists who go and take photos of these extrajudicial killings, and they told us that these are so common that now their editors are telling them that they can't even cover them anymore because they need a new angle, because these are happening so often that it's not even news anymore. And this particular journalist told us that the only thing that has changed is where they're dumping the bodies and how they're lying about it. And so this is a policy of the Philippine government to target and assassinate people they view as their enemies. And often those are people who stand in the way, like Brandon, who was standing up for people and their land and their rights. But sometimes it's just people who are poor who they can then say this person was involved with drugs or whatever it is, and are being targeted for assassinations. And it seems that the U.S. government not only is not speaking out on this, but continuing to provide hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid to the Philippine military, and there hasn't been attention to this by the Congress. You know, we've been calling for a hearing. We've been calling for our representatives here to speak out, not just on Brandon's case, but on the broader human rights situation in the Philippines.
Raquel Redondes, I wanted to ask you that there's been a lot of emphasis on covering what's happened with Duterte and the drug war, but not so much the government's war against environmental activists. The one report by Global Witness says that 30 people have been killed since Duterte became president, environmental activists, about 20% of all the environmental activists killed across the world.
Yeah, the reality is that the Philippines is still very rich in natural resources. And again, this is stories we've heard in the north, but also from indigenous communities in the south, in Mindanao, where it's still under martial law. And what we have is, whereas a lot of communities have already been devastated by logging corporations and agribusiness who are, utilizing their fertile land. Now, many multinationals, mining corporations are really looking to push them out of their ancestral domain so that they can take the natural resources from the ground. And so, as a result, like Supervisor Matt Haney said, anyone who stands in their way is harassed, intimidated, or outright massacred. We've heard this representatives from indigenous communities throughout Mindanao. We've heard this from school communities, students and teachers who are being forcibly evacuated from their schools because the government does not want them to learn how to read, how to write, how to stand up for their rights. It's not just environmentalists, but other human rights defenders and anyone who's organizing for their rights in the Philippines.
We want to thank you both so much for being with us. We will continue to follow the story of Brandon Lee, how he is and what's happening to him. Raquel Redondes, I want to thank you for being with us, member of the San Francisco Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines, friend of Brandon, visited him in the hospital, along with San Francisco Supervisor Matt Haney, who led a fact-finding mission to the Philippines last week. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we're going to talk about another American journalist and activist, Shwari Amoyele. He is a Nigerian-American. He also ran for president in Nigeria. He's been arrested and jailed in Nigeria for a month. We'll speak with his wife and a Columbia law professor about his situation. Stay with it. Here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to Nigeria, where journalist and pro-democracy activist Omoyele Sowore is entering his second month in jail for calling for peaceful nationwide protests against the government. Sowore called his movement Revolution Now and mobilized activists to take to the streets on August 5th. But just 2 days before the protests were set to begin, he was arrested by the state and accused of attempting to take over the government. He's been in prison for more than a month now as human rights groups continue continue to call for his immediate release. He's a human rights activist and the publisher of the online news site Sahara Reports, based in New York City, and has lived in the United States for many years. He ran against President Muhammadu Buhari earlier this year in an election he said lacked a level playing field. His party, Africa Action Congress, declared August 5th the start of the Days of Rage, inspired by the recent popular uprising in Sudan that toppled the authoritarian ruler Omar al-Bashir. The protests went ahead despite his arrest days earlier.
Shortly before Chouare was arrested, he tweeted, "All that's needed for a revolution is for the oppressed to choose a date they desire for liberty, not subjected to the approval of the oppressor." Hashtag Revolution Now, hashtag Days of Rage, hashtag August 5th. This is Omoyele Chouare speaking about Revolution Now at a rally in Nigeria in July.
Are you not tired of this government? We are tired. Are you not tired of hunger? We are tired. Are you not tired of no unemployment? We are tired.
A coalition of press freedom organizations and human rights groups recently petitioned the United Nations and the African Union, while a group called the African Renaissance Organization sent a petition to the U.S. State Department asking the U.S. government to apply pressure on President Muhammadu Buhari for Chouare's release. For more, we're joined by Omoyele Chouare's wife, Opieme Chouare, and one of his attorneys, Nana Jensen Reventlow, the founding director of the Digital Freedom Fund. She's at Columbia Law School. Opieme Chouare and Nina Jensen Reventlow, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us.
Thanks for having us.
You were here when Chouare was arrested in Nigeria, and I have to say I personally know Chouare very well. I traveled with him in Nigeria when we went to cover the U.S. oil companies' involvement in the Niger Delta and what they were doing there. He has been deeply involved with human rights and in covering his country of Nigeria, though a green card holder here. So when did you learn what happened, and what are you demanding now?
Sure. It was Friday night here, Saturday, in Nigeria. I got a text from him saying, "I love you." And I'm like, okay, great, I love you too. But his cousin started calling me over and over about an hour after that and told me that he'd been detained. And for 4 days, or 3 days, we did not have any contact with him. We didn't know where he was. He was taken by force at his hotel and in Lagos and transported to Abuja. And the capital of Nigeria. And of course, he didn't eat their food, didn't drink their water for all those days. He was basically in isolation with no food, no water. But then on the Tuesday after, he was able to get in touch with his lawyer, as well as they allowed people to come in to provide him with food. But since then, he's basically been in isolation for over a month, being held in Abuja with basically no outlets. He's basically locked in a room for the most part.
And the formal charges against him are based on?
There are no formal charges per se. He's being investigated. So the courts gave the Nigerian government or the DSS the ability to hold him for 45 days to investigate treason, possible treason and terrorism. They based it upon a meeting that he had with Nnamdi Kalu, who has an organization around Biafra. He met with him. Yele made it public. In fact, he disagrees with some of Nnamdi's rhetoric, but he met with him. And Yele's whole thing is bringing in everybody's voices so that Nigeria can be a country for pretty much all of its citizens. So that's one of the things that they mentioned against him. They also mentioned he may have taken money from international countries, and he met them in Dubai. He has never been to Dubai before, which was an interesting statement on the Nigerian government's part, and no money basically has been found with him. So those are some of the things that they've mentioned and associated with him, but they basically have no grounds for holding him and haven't found any evidence.
Nene Jensen-Reventlow, you are part of an international team of attorneys representing Shoure. Can you talk about how you got involved and the significance of his case here in the United States as well? Well known for founding Sahara reporters, reading his reports all the time on Nigeria.
I met Shoure for the first time when I still worked for the Media Legal Defense Initiative. We were supporting him in his defense of a number of cases that were brought against Sahara reporters here in the US for their critical investigative reporting. And I was alerted to his case shortly after his arrest and detention. And at that time, Shoure has a really good legal team in Nigeria that represents him, led by Mr. Femi Falana. And they're trying
very famous human rights
lawyer. And they're trying their best to challenge his detention. So far, unfortunately, that has been unsuccessful. So on behalf of a number of press freedom and human rights organizations, we filed the petition that you just mentioned, calling for the UN and AU special rapporteurs to intervene, basically, because we consider his arrest and detention to be arbitrary and a violation of his right to freedom of expression, freedom of association, and we want them to take action, basically.
And what's the general situation in Nigeria for journalists or other critics of the government? What kind of obstacles do they face?
It's generally a very challenging environment where both intimidation and also legal repercussions for critical reporting and generally voicing opposition or challenging the regime is met with consequences. So Shoure's arrest doesn't stand alone. There have been numerous arrests, also in the context of the 5 August demonstration that actually did take place, where numerous people were arrested, including a number of reporters that work for Sahara reporters, but various other human rights defenders in the country have been arrested over the past months.
So the Nigerian court justified Shoure's detention through the Terrorism Act. If you could expand on that. In a ruling on August 8th, the Federal High Court in Nigeria's capital city, Abuja, permitted the holding of Shoure without pressing any charges, and that can be extended. Is that right?
This is correct. So the Security Service filed an ex parte request for 90 days of detention under the Terrorism Act to conduct investigations, and an order was issued for 45 days of detention. This has been challenged, and last week, finally, this came to a hearing in court. But unfortunately, the judge that heard the petition from Mr. Falana and his team decided that he basically couldn't rule on the matter and referred the matter back to the original court that issued the order.
And I'm wondering if you had an opportunity to talk to your husband at all, and what are his spirits like? What has he told you, if you have?
Sure. They've allowed him to call twice, so he got to speak to myself and also the children.
How old are your kids?
9 and 12. He's definitely putting up a brave front, but it's hard. Staying in isolation for that long and having monitored calls with your family limits what he's able to say or how freely he's able to express himself.
And his use of the word revolution, for his organization, Revolution Now, Nani, if you could talk about the significance of this, they're saying that this amounts to treason. However, they themselves have used that word, talking about the need for revolution in Nigeria. Nigeria, Africa's most populous country.
Yeah. Shoure used the word revolution as an emotive term, and he's used this in the context of wanting to achieve transformative change throughout his career. When he founded Sahara Reporters, he said that he wanted to revolutionize news reporting by founding an organization that would rely on investigative citizen reporting. Interestingly, after his arrest, there was a large outcry within Nigeria, and many people indeed pointed to the fact that many of the officials that are currently in government have used the word revolution in the past as well.
And has the Trump administration intervened in any way to help Shoure?
Not that I'm aware.
Well, we'll continue to follow Choueiri's case, and people should read Sahara Reporters. He is the publisher and founder of that. I want to thank you both for being with us. Obieme Choueiri is the wife of Omoyele Choueiri, who was arrested August 3rd in Lagos, Nigeria. Nani Jansen Reventlow is a part of an international team of attorneys representing Choueiri here. That does it for our broadcast. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our website is democracynow.org. Thanks so much for joining us.